At the edge of older cities, just beyond the market roads and caravan yards, stood walled enclosures with narrow doors and no signs. Inside, a single chamber housed what the Zoroastrians guarded above all else: flame. It was not fire for light, nor heat, nor spectacle. It was continuity, kept alive through years of ruin, reform, exile, return. What began in scattered settlements grew into one of the world's oldest religious traditions, rooted in discipline, not display. There were no idols, no oracles, no courts. Only the fire, the keepers, and the order that grew around them. Through centuries of conquest and upheaval, they endured, not because they resisted change, but because they carried something older than kings, older than conquest. To understand Zoroastrians is to begin there, not with legend or doctrine, but with what was preserved in silence, for those who knew how to tend it. Long before empires rose in Persia, a lone voice in the steppe called mankind to choose truth over the lie. In the tribal camps of the Spitama clan, where cattle lowed in the pre-dawn darkness and smoke from dung fires mixed with morning mist, a child's first cry pierced the air, but then, impossibly, transformed into laughter. These flames served the Indo-Iranian peoples in ways that transcended mere warmth or protection. They were witnesses to oaths, receivers of sacrifice, and the very presence of divinity made manifest in the material world. Into this world of sacred hearths and warring gods, sometime in the second millennium before Christ, a child was born whose vision would transform not just his own people, but echo through the corridors of religious thought for 3,000 years. The boy who would become Zarathustra entered a society where the boundary between the seen and unseen realms was gossamer thin. His people, the Spitama clan, moved their herds across territories that would later be called Bactria, following patterns of migration that their ancestors had traced for untold generations. Theirs was a world populated by countless deities, some benevolent, others malicious, all demanding propitiation through elaborate rituals that consumed much of daily life. The Daivas, ancient gods of the Indo-Iranian pantheon, required blood sacrifice and careful ceremony, while the Ahuras, another class of divinities, governed cosmic order and social harmony. Among these pastoral peoples, fire held supreme position in religious life. Not merely a tool for survival in the harsh steppes, the sacred element served as the medium through which mortals communicated with the divine realm. Every household maintained its hearth with religious devotion, understanding that to let the flames die was to invite catastrophe upon the family. Priests known as Athravans tended communal fires with elaborate ceremonies, feeding the flames with offerings of fat and fragrant wood, while chanting hymns that had been passed down through countless generations. Young Zoroaster, as the Greeks would later render his name, grew to manhood in this environment of ritual complexity and theological confusion. Ancient sources, though written centuries after his death, preserve traditions suggesting he was marked from birth for an extraordinary destiny. Legends speak of supernatural signs attending his arrival: the infant laughing rather than crying at birth, evil spirits fleeing from his presence, and attempts on his life by servants of the lie, who recognized the threat he would pose to their dominion. Whether these tales reflect historical memory or later hagiography, they point to a fundamental truth about the prophet's early life. From youth, he was recognized as different, set apart from his contemporaries by an intensity of spiritual seeking that found no satisfaction in traditional answers. While his peers concerned themselves with the practical matters of herding and warfare, the young visionary pondered questions that struck at the heart of existence itself. Why did the righteous suffer while the wicked prospered? What force governed the apparent chaos of the world? Could the countless deities truly all deserve worship? Or was there a deeper truth hidden behind the multiplicity of divine names? His questioning led him away from the settlements of his people and into the wilderness, following a pattern of spiritual retreat that would echo through the lives of future prophets and sages. In the solitude of mountain caves and beside the rushing waters of the Daiti River, he sought answers that the Athrivans could not provide. Years passed in meditation and purification as the seeker prepared himself for a revelation that would shatter the theological foundations of his world. The transformative moment arrived when Zarathustra had reached the age of 30, according to the traditional accounts preserved in the Avesta. Standing at the banks of the deity at dawn, performing ritual ablutions for a spring festival, he experienced an encounter that would redirect the course of human religious consciousness. Vohu Mana, the good mind, appeared to him in a vision of overwhelming brilliance and conducted his spirit into the presence of Ahura Mazda, the wise lord who stood revealed as the supreme deity above all others. In that blazing theophany, the prophet received a revelation that overturned everything his culture had taught about the nature of divinity and cosmic order. Ahura Mazda was not merely the greatest among many gods, but the sole creator of the universe, the source of all light and truth, locked in primordial conflict with Angramenyu, the destructive spirit who embodied falsehood and chaos. The Daivas, whom his people had worshipped with such careful ceremony, were exposed as false gods, not merely inferior deities, but active agents of the lie who led humanity astray through deception and the promise of material power. This cosmic dualism presented a universe divided between the forces of Asha, truth, righteousness, order, and Daryuj, falsehood, deceit, chaos, with every being required to choose sides in the struggle. Yet unlike the fatalistic worldviews that dominated ancient thought, the revelation emphasized human agency and responsibility. Each person possessed the power to strengthen either truth or falsehood through their thoughts, words, and deeds. The battlefield was not merely cosmic, but intensely personal, fought in every moral decision and ethical choice. The implications of this message were revolutionary in ways that are difficult to appreciate from our modern perspective. In a world where religion was fundamentally transactional, where gods were appeased through sacrifice to ensure favorable outcomes, Zarathustra proclaimed that the supreme deity desired not blood but righteousness, not ritual precision but ethical conduct. The triadic formula of good thoughts, good words, good deeds replaced complex ceremonial requirements with a moral philosophy accessible to all, regardless of social station or priestly training. Returning from his divine encounter, the prophet began to preach his message to a world utterly unprepared for its implications. His first convert, tellingly, was his cousin Maidyoi Mangha, who would remain a faithful companion through the years of rejection that followed. For a decade, the visionary wandered from settlement to settlement, challenging the religious establishment and finding few willing to abandon the gods of their fathers for this strange new teaching. Opposition came most fiercely from the Kavis and Karapans, the priest classes who saw their authority threatened by a message that relegated their elaborate rituals to the realm of demonic deception. These guardians of tradition wielded enormous social power, controlling access to the divine through their monopoly on sacred knowledge and ceremonial expertise. The prophets claimed that individuals could approach Ahura Mazda directly, without priestly mediation, struck at the economic and political foundations of their influence. Physical danger accompanied theological opposition. The Gathas, those ancient hymns attributed to Zarathustra himself, speak of persecution exile, and poverty endured for the sake of truth. Rival priests accused him of seeking to destroy social order, of turning children against parents and subjects against rulers. In a society where religious and political authority were inextricably linked, his message appeared not merely heretical but seditious. The breakthrough came when the prophet, now entering middle age and worn by years of rejection, arrived at the court of King Vishtaspa. This ruler, whose exact historical identity remains debated by scholars, governed a territory somewhere in eastern Iran, possibly in Bactria or Margiana. Unlike the tribal chieftains who had dismissed the new teaching as dangerous innovation, Vishtaspa possessed both the intellectual curiosity and political independence to give the prophet a hearing. Court traditions preserved in later texts describe a series of theological debates in which Zarathustra faced the kingdom's wisest priests and philosophers. Through a combination of logical argument, ethical appeal, and what sources describe as miraculous signs, he gradually won over not just the king, but his queen Hutayosa and key court officials. The conversion of Vishtaspa marked the transformation of the new faith from persecuted sect to state-supported religion, providing the institutional foundation necessary for its survival and expansion. Under royal patronage, the prophet's teachings began to spread beyond the immediate circle of early converts. The Gathas were composed during this period, 17 hymns in an archaic dialect that preserve what scholars consider the authentic voice of the founder. These texts, dense with metaphor and theological complexity, reveal a thinker of remarkable sophistication, grappling with fundamental questions of existence, morality, and human destiny. Central to the Gathic worldview was the concept of free will as both gift and responsibility. Unlike the deterministic cosmologies that surrounded them, these hymns proclaimed human beings as active participants in the cosmic struggle, whose choices carried consequences extending beyond individual life into the fate of creation itself. Each person would face judgment after death, crossing the Chinvat bridge where their deeds would be weighed and their destination determined not by divine caprice, but by the moral weight of their own actions. Fire assumed new significance within this theological framework, no longer merely the recipient of sacrifice or the medium of ritual purification. The sacred element became the supreme symbol of Asher, pure, luminous, and opposed to all darkness and deception. The prophet taught that fire resided not just in external flames, but within the human soul itself, a divine spark that could be strengthened through righteous living or dimmed by evil choices. This internalization of the sacred would profoundly influence how his followers understood their relationship with both divinity and the material world. The establishment of the faith under Vishtaspa's protection allowed for the development of institutional structures that would ensure its survival. The prophet trained disciples who could carry his message to distant communities, established procedures for maintaining sacred fires that would serve as focal points for worship, and began the process of organizing his revelations into a coherent theological system. Yet he remained first and foremost a prophet rather than an administrator, continuing to receive visions and compose hymns that expanded and refined his initial revelation. Opposition did not cease with royal conversion. Neighboring rulers, allied with traditional priesthoods, viewed the spread of the new faith as a threat to established order. The Gathas speak of conflicts and battles, suggesting that the prophet's later years were marked by violence as his royal patron defended the new religion against external threats. Some traditions even attribute the prophet's death to assassination by a rival priest, though historical details remain uncertain. What emerges clearly from even the most skeptical analysis of sources is the portrait of a religious genius whose vision fundamentally altered humanity's understanding of the divine-human relationship. In a world of polytheistic complexity, he proclaimed ethical monotheism. Against fatalistic acceptance of cosmic chaos, he preached moral purpose and ultimate justice. Where others saw ritual precision as the path to divine favor, he emphasized internal transformation and ethical conduct. By the time of his death, whether peacefully in old age or violently at enemy hands, Zarathustra had set in motion a religious revolution whose consequences would ripple through millennia. His reduction of cosmic complexity to a fundamental choice between truth and falsehood, his emphasis on individual moral responsibility, his vision of history moving toward a final renovation where evil would be destroyed and creation perfected. All these concepts would profoundly influence not just the Persian peoples who first received them, but eventually Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Standing at the threshold between prehistory and recorded time, the prophet appears to us through layers of legend and theological interpretation. Yet the core of his message remains startlingly clear and eternally relevant, that each human being faces a fundamental choice between truth and deception, that this choice carries cosmic significance, and that the divine desires not blood sacrifice but lives lived in accordance with righteousness. In those wind-swept plains where tribal fires had once served countless deities, a new understanding was taking root. The flames still burned, but now they pointed beyond themselves to an invisible fire that burned within every human soul, a spark of the divine that could choose, moment by moment, to align itself with truth or surrender to the lie. The prophet had spoken, and though his voice would soon fall silent, the fire he had kindled would burn on through the centuries, carrying light into darkness and calling each generation to make the eternal choice between Asher and Druj. 5 centuries had passed since the prophet's voice fell silent, and his teachings had spread through the Iranian plateau, like water seeping through limestone, slowly, invisibly, fundamentally altering the landscape of belief. By the time a minor Persian chieftain named Cyrus began consolidating power in the mountains of Fars, the faith had evolved from a revolutionary message into a living tradition, practiced in villages and noble courts alike, though not yet bearing the institutional weight of monarchy. Cyrus, whom history would surname the Great, inherited more than tribal leadership when he assumed control of the Achaemenid clan around 559 BC. His worldview had been shaped by generations of Mazdean influence, though the exact nature of his personal devotion remains a matter of scholarly debate. What cannot be disputed is that when he overthrew the Median kingdom and began his unprecedented conquests, he carried with him a conception of kingship profoundly influenced by the prophet's teachings, that earthly rule must reflect divine justice, that the sovereign served as the wise lord's representative in maintaining Asher against the forces of chaos. The cylinder seal that bears Cyrus's proclamation to Babylon speaks not in the language of conquest, but of liberation and restoration. Though the text itself invokes Marduk, rather than Ahura Mazda, a diplomatic necessity when addressing Babylonian subjects, its underlying philosophy echoes the Persian religious principles: the ruler as shepherd of diverse peoples, the restoration of temples and repatriation of exiled populations, the maintenance of order through justice rather than terror. This was sovereignty conceived not as divine right to exploit, but as holy responsibility to protect and nurture. Under the early Achaemenids, flames attained a significance that transcended their role in daily worship. Royal inscriptions began to invoke the Lord of Wisdom as the source of legitimate authority, while court ceremonies incorporated the luminous element in ways that proclaimed the dynasty's role as earthly guardians of cosmic order. Yet this was not the establishment of a state religion in any modern sense. The Persians, guided by principles their tradition had taught them about the multiplicity of paths to truth, allowed conquered peoples to maintain their own beliefs, while gradually absorbing concepts of divine justice and cosmic struggle. When Darius I seized power in 522 BC, after a period of dynastic chaos, he left posterity the most explicit testament to Achaemenid religious conviction, carved into the living rock at Behistun. Rising 300 feet above the ancient road linking Babylon with Ecbatana, the trilingual inscription proclaims his legitimacy through direct appeal to divine sanction. By the favor of Ahura Mazda am I king. The wise Lord brought me help. The relief above these words shows the king receiving his authority from heaven while trampling the lie, made manifest in the form of defeated rebels beneath his feet. More revealing than royal proclamations was the integration of ethical principles into Persian administration. The concept of Asha, that fundamental truth order that Zarathustra had proclaimed as the basis of cosmic harmony, became the organizing principle of Achaemenid governance. Provincial satraps were evaluated not merely on tribute collection, but on their maintenance of justice and prosperity within their territories. The royal judges traveled established circuits to ensure that local administration reflected the higher law that emanated from divine, rather than merely royal authority. Persepolis itself, that magnificent complex of palaces and ceremonial halls that Darius began and his successors expanded, embodied in stone the theological principles that guided the realm. The famous Apadana reliefs, showing delegations from every corner of the known world, bringing tribute to the King of Kings, depicted not subjugation, but participation in a cosmic order. Each people retained their distinctive dress and customs, their dignity preserved even as they acknowledged Persian sovereignty. The architectural program proclaimed unity in diversity, a political theology that saw monarchical rule as the earthly reflection of divine harmony. Throughout the Persian dominions, burning altars began to appear, though not yet the elaborate temple structures that would characterize later periods. These installations ranged from simple platforms where holy flames burned under open sky, to more elaborate constructions that sheltered the radiance while allowing smoke to escape freely. Royal ceremonies required the presence of the eternal element as witness and sanctifier. No treaty was valid, no appointment confirmed, without its silent testimony to the proceedings. Among the paradoxes of Achaemenid religion was the absence of a formal priesthood on the scale that would later develop. The Magi, that hereditary caste of ritual specialists from Media who had maintained their influence through the dynasty's rise, served crucial ceremonial functions, but did not yet constitute the organized hierarchy they would become. Individual families maintained their own hearths, according to traditions passed through generations, while royal flames required more elaborate tending, but still lacked the complex institutional structure of later periods. The prophets' hymns, the Gathas, continued to be transmitted through oral tradition, sung in an archaic dialect that fewer and fewer could fully understand. Yet their essential message had been translated into the vernacular of Persian power. The call to choose between truth and falsehood became the royal mandate to govern justly. The promise of cosmic renovation found expression in the Persian peace that brought unprecedented prosperity to vast territories. The individual soul's journey toward judgment paralleled the realm's mission to establish divine order throughout the known world. Xerxes, succeeding his father Darius in 486 BC, left inscriptions that reveal an evolution in royal religious policy. His famous diver inscription at Persepolis speaks of destroying the temples of false gods and establishing the worship of the creator in their place, the first clear evidence of something approaching religious compulsion within Persian territories. Yet even this intervention seems limited to specific rebellious regions, rather than representing a systematic program of conversion. The balance between Mazdian conviction and political pragmatism remained delicate, never quite tipping into the theocratic absolutism that would characterize other ancient kingdoms. In Babylon, ancient rituals of flame dedicated to indigenous gods were reinterpreted through the lens of Persian theology. Egyptian priests found parallels between their own concepts of Mayat, truth, justice, order, and the Persian Asha, facilitating a theological synthesis that allowed both traditions to coexist. Even the Greeks, those keen observers of Persian custom, noted how the rulers refused to defile the primal elements, seeing in this practice a religious sophistication that contrasted with their own more casual treatment of nature's forces. The role of women in Achaemenid religious life reflected Zarathustra's relatively egalitarian vision, though filtered through the hierarchies of court society. Royal women maintained their own altars and could commission religious foundations independently of male relatives. Artistone, wife of Darius, left inscriptions recording her personal devotion to the Lord of Wisdom. This female participation in religious life would leave traces in Persian practice that persisted even through later periods of restriction. When Persian armies marched across continents, they carried their faith with them in forms that would prove crucial for the tradition's survival in later periods of persecution. Holy flames accompanied the forces in special containers that allowed the radiance to be transported without extinguishing, tended by specialists who combined the roles of chaplain and keeper of the light. These mobile altars demonstrated that divine power was not bound to specific locations, but could sanctify any ground where truth confronted falsehood, where Persian arms carried the mandate of cosmic order against the forces of chaos. By the reign of Artaxerxes II, evolutionary changes in the religion had become clearly visible. Royal inscriptions now invoked not just the supreme deity, but also Anahita and Mithra as divine protectors of the dynasty. Whether this represented a theological retreat from strict monotheism, or simply the public acknowledgement of practices that had always existed at popular levels, remains debated. What seems clear is that the Mazdian tradition had proven flexible enough to incorporate diverse religious impulses while maintaining its essential ethical core. The twilight years of Persian dominance witnessed both the apotheosis and crisis of Achaemenid religion. Persepolis had become not merely an administrative center, but a consecrated complex where the New Year festival of Nowruz embodied the cosmic renewal that the ancient teacher had envisioned. Delegations from across the known world participated in ceremonies that reenacted the triumph of order over chaos. Their tribute transformed through ritual into offerings that sustained the divine economy of the universe. Yet this very grandeur contained seeds of vulnerability. The identification between dynasty and deity meant that political failure could precipitate religious crisis. When Alexander's Macedonian phalanxes shattered Persian forces at Gaugamela in 331 BC, they destroyed more than a political system. The conflagration that consumed Persepolis sent smoke billowing into the sky, that observers interpreted as the eternal flames themselves protesting the cosmic injustice of the conquest. Priests fled with what texts and implements they could salvage, beginning a pattern of preservation through dispersal that would characterize the community's survival strategies for centuries to come. Standing in the ruins of the Apadana, where carved flames still decorate the robes of stone immortals, one can perceive both the glory and the tragedy of the Persian religious synthesis. The teacher's vision had found royal expression on a scale he could never have imagined. His call for individual choice between truth and falsehood transformed into a mandate for universal justice administered by divinely sanctioned kings. Simple altar flames that had once burned in mountain shrines now occupied palatial installations where gold and silver implements reflected their luminescence. Beyond material glory, the dynasty's most profound contribution may have been its commitment to theological openness within the bounds of one God. The Achaemenids had demonstrated that exclusive faith need not require the suppression of other traditions, that divine truth could manifest through diverse cultural forms, that monarchy could serve as the protector rather than the destroyer of religious diversity. These lessons, learned in the centuries between Cyrus and Alexander, would prove crucial for the community's survival when the protective shelter of royal power was stripped away. The flame of the Creator burned beside the crown, a light not for one tribe, but for a world-spanning dominion. That realm now lay in ruins, its palaces burned, its priests scattered. But the holy radiance itself endured, carried in portable vessels by fleeing magi, maintained in remote mountain shrines by faithful communities, preserved in the memories and practices of a people who had learned that divine truth transcended any earthly kingdom. The Achaemenids had given the prophet's legacy the gift of continental scope and institutional structure. Now the ancient faith would discover whether it could survive without them. Smoke still rose from the blackened stones of Persepolis when the first magi began their long journey into the mountains. They carried with them more than the physical remnants of their faith. Bronze vessels containing embers from the royal flames, ritual implements wrapped in silk, and memories of ceremonies that stretched back to the prophet himself. Behind them, Macedonian soldiers picked through the ruins of the Apadana, searching for gold while trampling on reliefs that had depicted the cosmic order their conquest had shattered. Alexander himself, that brilliant destroyer of worlds, understood little of what he had obliterated. To him and his generals, the Persian religion appeared as merely another collection of barbarian superstitions, notable only for its peculiar reverence for flame and its prohibition against defiling the elements. Yet even as the conqueror pushed eastward toward India, leaving Greek garrisons to control the heartland of the former Achaemenid realm, the faith he had sought to extinguish was already adapting to survive in a world without kings. In the chaos that followed the Macedonian conquest, something remarkable began to emerge from the scattered communities of believers. Where once the royal altars had burned in palatial splendor, new forms of worship arose that would prove more enduring than any dynasty. The Magi, who had fled Persepolis, discovered that their reception in rural areas exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Village communities that had maintained their own traditions for centuries suddenly found themselves the guardians of a heritage that city dwellers and court officials could no longer protect. The mountains of Media became a particular refuge for the old religion. Here, in valleys that Greek armies rarely troubled to patrol, the eternal flames found new homes in structures that represented a revolution in religious architecture. The Shartak, the four-arched sanctuary, emerged as the distinctive form of the Zoroastrian temple, its open sides allowing the smoke to escape while protecting the flame from wind and rain. These buildings, modest in scale compared to the grand installations of Persepolis, possessed an elegance that derived from their perfect adaptation to their purpose. Consider the first true fire temple at Adur-Farnbag, built somewhere in the mountains of Fars during these turbulent decades. Unlike the open-air altars of the Achaemenid period, this structure enclosed the holy element within walls of stone. creating an inner sanctum where only consecrated priests could enter. The flame itself burned not on a simple platform, but in a bronze urn placed upon a pedestal, elevating it above the earth it must not touch. Around this central chamber, additional rooms provided space for ritual preparation and the storage of consecrated implements. By setting the holy flame beneath the earth, architects overcame long-standing difficulties that earlier shrines had struggled to manage. By sinking the fire chamber partially into the earth, builders created natural insulation that maintained stable temperatures regardless of external weather. The design also provided symbolic meaning. The holy light emerged from the depths, like truth rising from hidden sources, while the descent required to approach it reminded worshippers of the humility necessary for genuine devotion. Seleucus, Alexander's successor in the eastern portions of the conquered territories, established a form of rule that differed markedly from both Macedonian and Persian precedents. The Seleucid approach to governing their vast domains required accommodation with local traditions, particularly in regions where direct military control proved impractical. This pragmatic policy created space for the Mazdean faith to reconstitute itself, though now without the official patronage that had sustained it for centuries. During these decades of foreign rule, the process of codifying ritual practice accelerated dramatically. What had previously been transmitted through personal instruction and family tradition now required systematic preservation. The Vendidad, that priestly code concerned with maintaining ritual purity, began to take definitive form as communities sought to maintain orthodox practice without the guidance of a central religious authority. Each regulation, from the proper method of disposing of nail clippings to the complex procedures for purifying those who had contact with death, served to maintain community identity in the face of Hellenistic cultural pressure. The distinction between three grades of consecrated flames emerged during this period as a practical response to changed circumstances. The Atash Dadgar, or fire of the house, could be established by any believer and required only basic rituals for its consecration. These domestic altars ensured that every household could maintain its connection to the divine light, regardless of access to formal temples. The Atash Adaran, requiring more elaborate ceremonies and intended for community worship, began to appear in towns where sufficient numbers of the faithful could support a permanent installation. Most sacred of all, the Atash Behram demanded such complex purification rituals that only a few could be established, each serving as a regional center of pilgrimage and advanced religious instruction. In Babylon, where Alexander had died and his empire had begun its fragmentation, the ancient Magi found themselves in an unexpectedly advantageous position. The city's traditional priesthoods had been disrupted by successive conquests, while the Zoroastrian emphasis on ethical conduct and cosmic order appealed to merchants and administrators seeking stability in turbulent times. The wise men established teaching centers where they transmitted not only ritual knowledge, but also the astronomical and mathematical learning that had long been associated with their caste. What began as a simple cleansing, the Padiab transformed into a detailed ceremony that emphasized the separation of ordinary life from holy ground. Worshippers learned to perform the Kushti ritual, wrapping and unwrapping the sacred cord, while reciting prayers that reaffirmed their commitment to good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. These physical actions anchored abstract theology in bodily practice, creating a form of worship that engaged the whole person rather than merely the intellect. Hellenistic influence, despite its association with conquest and foreign domination, contributed unexpectedly to the development of religious thought. Greek philosophical concepts, Particularly, the notion of cosmic harmony and the immortality of the soul found resonance with teachings that dated back to the prophet himself. Young magi studying in Babylonian academies encountered Aristotelian logic and Platonic metaphysics, tools that would eventually help them articulate their ancient faith in new philosophical languages. These years of upheaval posed the greatest threat yet to the spoken legacy of the Avesta. The ancient Gathic dialect had become comprehensible only to specialists, while the spoken languages of the faithful diverged increasingly from the sacred tongue. In response, a system of precise memorization developed that preserved not merely the words, but their exact pronunciation, pitch, and rhythm. Students spent years learning to reproduce the hymns with perfect accuracy, understanding that even minor variations might corrupt the spiritual power contained within the ancient verses. Wood for the eternal fires became a matter of theological as well as practical concern. Different grades of fuel were specified for various ceremonies. Sandalwood for the highest rituals, specific fruit woods for community celebrations, and carefully dried woods free from any decay for daily maintenance. The gathering and preparation of this fuel became a religious act in itself, with prayers accompanying each stage of the process. Communities developed networks of suppliers who understood the spiritual significance of their trade, ensuring that appropriate materials remained available even in regions where the specified trees did not grow naturally. Among the most significant developments of the Hellenistic period was the emergence of organized communities centered around their temples. Where the Achaemenid period had seen religious life organized primarily through family and court structures, the new era required different forms of association. The Onjuman, or religious assembly, arose as the governing body for local communities, responsible for maintaining the temple, supporting the priests, and ensuring the transmission of the faith to future generations. These assemblies operated with a degree of democratic participation that would have surprised both Persian kings and Greek philosophers. As circumstances transformed, so too did the roles of women in Mazdaean religious life, building on a legacy of deep-rooted significance. With the dissolution of royal patronage, wealthy women became crucial supporters of temple construction and maintenance. The Herbard's wife often served as instructor for young girls in the community, teaching them the prayers and rituals that would enable them to maintain household devotion. Some women achieved recognition as scholars of the religious texts, though their teaching remained largely confined to female students. By the time Antiochus I succeeded his father Seleucus in 281 BC, the transformation of the ancient faith was essentially complete. What had begun as a prophet's vision and developed into an imperial ideology had evolved into something more resilient, a temple-centered religion capable of surviving without royal support. The eternal flames now burned in hundreds of locations across the former Achaemenid territories, each one a center of community life and religious instruction. The sacred architecture continued to evolve in response to local conditions and materials. In the harsh winters of Media, double walls provided insulation for the flame chambers. In the earthquake-prone regions of the Iranian plateau, flexible construction techniques allowed temples to survive tremors that leveled more rigid structures. Each variation maintained the essential elements: the central flame, the consecrated space around it, and the architectural arrangements that facilitated ritual purity while adapting to specific environmental challenges. Memory of the prophet himself underwent transformation during these centuries. No longer the radical reformer who had challenged the religious establishment of his day, Zarathustra became, in retrospective imagination, the founder of an ancient tradition stretching back to the beginning of time. Stories of his life acquired miraculous elements that emphasized his role as the supreme lawgiver and the perfect practitioner of the faith he had established. This mythologization served important functions, providing the community with an idealized model while obscuring some of the more radical elements of his original message. Competition with other religious traditions sharpened theological distinctions and forced greater precision in doctrine. The spread of Buddhism from India brought concepts of withdrawal from the world that contrasted sharply with the Zoroastrian emphasis on engagement with creation. Mystery religions from the Mediterranean offered personal salvation through secret initiation, challenging the Mazdian insistence that truth should be openly proclaimed. In response, teachers developed more sophisticated explanations of their doctrines, emphasizing the unique features that distinguished their tradition from superficially similar alternatives. The concept of the Fravashi, the pre-existent soul or guardian spirit, gained prominence during this period as communities sought to maintain connection with deceased members. Ceremonies honoring the Fravashis of the righteous dead became elaborate affairs, particularly during the festival of Fravadigan, when the spirits were believed to return to Earth. These rituals served to reinforce community bonds across generations, while providing comfort to those who had lost family members during the upheavals of conquest and displacement. Though the king was gone and temples defiled, the holy radiance still whispered, guarded by priests, by mountains, by memory. In village shrines and urban sanctuaries, in the portable altars of traveling merchants and the household flames of countless families, the ancient faith demonstrated a vitality that political catastrophe could not extinguish. The Magi, who had fled the burning of Persepolis as refugees, had become the architects of a religious revival that would endure for millennia. Their transformation of the old faith from royal cult to community religion, from oral tradition to codified practice, from ethnic heritage to universal message, ensured that the sacred flames would continue burning long after the names of kings and conquerors had faded from human memory. Mithridates. I rode into Ctesiphon as the sun dipped below the Tigris, his Parthian cavalry casting long shadows across the conquered Seleucid capital. Unlike Alexander's destruction 3 generations earlier, this conquest brought not devastation, but restoration. The new ruler's first act was to rekindle the sacred flames that had been reduced to embers in household shrines, proclaiming that the ancient faith of Iran would once again enjoy royal protection. After centuries of foreign domination, a dynasty had emerged that understood the power of spiritual legitimacy. The Parthians, those horse lords from the northeastern steppes, had inherited more than territorial control when they swept across the Iranian plateau. They absorbed the deep cultural memory of Achaemenid glory and the devotional traditions that had survived in village communities and mountain sanctuaries. Yet their approach to faith differed markedly from their predecessors. Where the Achaemenids had integrated priestly influence into a centralized state, the Arsacids presided over a loose confederation of noble houses, each maintaining its own holy flames and ritual practices. This decentralized structure proved remarkably beneficial for theological development. Local variations in practice, rather than being suppressed in favor of orthodoxy, flourished under the protection of regional lords. The great flame of Adur-Burzanmir, established in Parthia proper, developed its own distinctive ceremonies that emphasized the agricultural cycles crucial to the region. Meanwhile, the ancient sanctuary of Adur-Farnbag in Fars maintained rituals that traced their origins to the prophet himself. creating a rich tapestry of regional traditions within the broader faith. Noble families competed in their patronage of consecrated establishments, each seeking to demonstrate superior piety through the magnificence of their endowments. The Suran clan, second only to the Achaemenids themselves in power and prestige, transformed their hereditary shrine near Sakistan into a center of learning that attracted students from across the Iranian world. The Karen family established a network of road sanctuaries where travelers could perform their devotions, understanding that mobility and commerce required spiritual infrastructure adapted to new patterns of life. During the long centuries of Parthian rule, the Magi evolved from a persecuted priesthood into a powerful social institution. No longer dependent solely on monarchical favor, they had developed independent sources of wealth through land endowments and commercial ventures. The most successful sanctuaries controlled vast estates worked by peasants who paid their tithes in grain and livestock, creating economic foundations that could survive dynastic changes. This material security allowed for the development of elaborate ceremonial life and the support of scholars dedicated to preserving and interpreting the holy traditions. The calendar itself became a battlefield of doctrinal control during this period. Various systems competed for acceptance, each carrying implications for when festivals should be celebrated and how ritual time should be organized. The eventual adoption of a standardized Zoroastrian calendar, with its 12 months named after celestial beings and its careful integration of solar and ritual cycles, represented more than astronomical precision. It demonstrated the faith's capacity to create unified systems from diverse traditions, binding communities together through shared consecrated time. Nowruz, the spring equinox celebration, evolved from a court ceremony into a popular festival that united all levels of society. The kindling of new flames from the dying embers of the old year's fires became a powerful symbol of cosmic renewal, enacted in every household and temple. Sadeh, the midwinter flame festival, provided light and hope during the darkest season, its bonfires serving as earthly reflections of the heavenly radiance that would ultimately triumph over darkness. Merigan, honoring the Yazata Mithra, celebrated the harvest and the bonds of contract and friendship that held society together. In the workshops attached to major shrines, artisans developed new forms of devotional art that would influence Iranian aesthetics for centuries. Fire altars appeared on coins, their stylized flames proclaiming regal dedication to the good religion. Rock reliefs depicted kings receiving celestial investiture before eternal flames, the holy element serving as witness to the covenant between heaven and earth. Even secular objects, drinking vessels, weapons, textiles, incorporated spiritual symbols that proclaimed their owner's faith. The rise of the Sasanian dynasty in 224 AD marked a watershed in the faith's history, as decisive as any political revolution. Ardashir I, claiming descent from the Achaemenids and heavenly sanction for his rebellion against the last Parthian ruler, understood that legitimacy required more than military victory. His early coins showed him standing before a flame altar, while his rock reliefs at Naqshi Rostam depicted Ahura Mazda handing him the ring of sovereignty. This was kingship reimagined as hallowed office, with the Shah serving as the earthly champion of truth against the lie. Kartir, the zealous priest who served 4 Sasanian monarchs, embodied the transformation of clerical power under the new dispensation. Rising from obscurity to become the most influential spiritual figure in the realm, he left inscriptions proclaiming his achievements, establishing fire temples throughout the dominion, codifying ritual law, and, most controversially, persecuting those he deemed heretics. His career demonstrated both the possibilities and dangers of combining priestly influence with state power. The establishment of the three great consecrated fires marked the institutional apex of Sasanian policy. Adur Farnbag, the ancient flame in Fars, was designated as the special protector of the priesthood. Its elaborate consecration rites, requiring the combination of flames from thousands of household hearths, demonstrated the unity of all believers in maintaining cosmic order. Pilgrims who completed the arduous journey to witness this supreme flame returned to their communities, bearing embers that physically linked local worship to the realm's spiritual center. Adur Gushnasp, established near Lake Urmia in Azerbaijan, became the warrior's flame. Sovereigns themselves made pilgrimage to this northern sanctuary before major campaigns, seeking celestial blessing for their arms. The journey, undertaken on foot as an act of devotion, might take months to complete. Bahramurf, that most legendary of warrior kings, reportedly walked barefoot for the final stages, demonstrating that even the crown must humble itself before eternal truth. Adur Burzen Mir, the farmer's flame, occupied a site in Parthia that linked it to the agricultural heartland. Its festivals aligned with planting and harvest cycles. Its prayers focused on the productivity of the earth and the welfare of those who worked it. This tripartite division, priests, warriors, farmers, reflected an idealized social order that probably never existed in pure form, but provided a powerful organizing principle for theological and social thought. Shaping the Avesta into its final form stood as the era's most lasting contribution to spiritual life. What had existed as scattered texts and oral traditions became a massive corpus organized into nasks or books, each dealing with specific aspects of doctrine, ritual, and law. The process required not merely collecting existing materials, but making decisions about authenticity, interpretation, and organization that would shape the faith for centuries to come. Under Sasanian patronage, holy architecture achieved new heights of sophistication. The great complex at Takhti Soliman, built around a volcanic lake whose depths seemed to connect with the underworld itself, demonstrated how natural features could be incorporated into consecrated space. The central flame burned in a chamber whose domed ceiling represented the cosmos, while subsidiary buildings housed libraries, treasuries, and accommodation for the hundreds of priests required to maintain perpetual ceremonies. The Barshnum purification ritual, always important in maintaining ritual purity, evolved into an elaborate 9-night ceremony during this period. Candidates for the highest grades of priesthood underwent this ordeal in special chambers attached to major sanctuaries, emerging transformed and authorized to tend the most hallowed flames. The physical requirements, isolation, repeated ablutions, dietary restrictions, served to separate the initiate from ordinary life while preparing them for their consecrated duties. Supporting these structures required economic systems that grew into surprisingly advanced forms. The concept of the pious foundation, where lands were dedicated in perpetuity to maintaining eternal flames and supporting priests, created wealth that no monarch could confiscate. These endowments operated according to detailed contracts that specified everything, from the number of rites to be performed to the quality of wood to be used in the holy fires. Some foundations supported entire communities of priests, students, and servants, becoming economic centers in their own right. Theological speculation flourished under court patronage, producing sophisticated examinations of cosmology, ethics, and eschatology. The question of celestial justice, why the righteous suffered while the wicked prospered, received elaborate treatment that would influence Islamic and Jewish thought. The nature of time itself became a subject of intense debate, with some thinkers proposing that Zervan, infinite time, stood above even the wise Lord and the destructive spirit as the source of all existence. This Zervanite tendency demonstrated the intellectual vitality of Sasanian thought. The idea that the cosmic struggle between good and evil occurred within a framework of infinite time that would ultimately resolve all contradictions appealed to philosophically minded believers. Yet it also threatened the ethical urgency of Zarathustra's original message, suggesting that human choice mattered less if all outcomes were predetermined by temporal necessity. Though shaped by both tradition and changing norms, women, especially those of status, continued to influence religious life through patronage and devotion. The flames tended by women in their household shrines were considered no less pure than those maintained by male priests in great establishments. Yet the elaboration of purity laws increasingly limited women's participation in public rites, particularly during menstruation, when they were considered temporarily aligned with forces of decay and death. Relations between the Zoroastrian establishment and other faith communities varied dramatically over the centuries. Periods of zealous orthodoxy, often coinciding with external military threats, saw persecution of Christians, Manichaeans, and Jews. Yet practical governance of a diverse realm required tolerance, and many minorities found ways to accommodate themselves to Sasanian rule while maintaining their distinctive practices. The Jewish academies of Babylonia flourished under Persian protection, producing the Talmud during the same centuries that saw the Avesta's final compilation. These wars were not just fought with swords, but with sacred intent that reached beyond battlefield blessings. The consecrated flames accompanied armies in portable shrines, providing continuity of worship even in foreign lands. When Khosrau I captured Antioch from the Byzantines, he rebuilt it as a Persian city complete with flame sanctuaries, demonstrating that conquest meant extending the realm of truth rather than merely acquiring territory. With Sasanian sponsorship, cultural expression expanded into realms far richer and more varied than devotion alone. The translation movement that brought Indian and Greek texts into Persian created a cosmopolitan intellectual culture centered on the court and major shrines. Music, medicine, and astronomy flourished under regal backing, with theological institutions serving as centers of learning that preserved and transmitted knowledge across generations. By the reign of Khosrau II at the beginning of the 7th century, the synthesis of spiritual and monarchical power seemed complete. The ruler's titles proclaimed him the chosen of the Creator, the maintainer of holy fires, the defender of truth against all manifestations of the lie. Palace rituals integrated devotional practices so thoroughly that governance itself became a form of worship. The realm's prosperity seemed to vindicate this close alliance between throne and altar. Ironically, the triumphs carried a risk. With spiritual and political power intertwined, military failure often looked like a sign of lost favor from above. The enormous wealth accumulated by pious foundations excited envy and resentment among those excluded from their benefits. Most critically, the emphasis on ritual purity and hereditary priesthood created barriers between specialists and ordinary believers that the prophet himself might not have recognized. Now flames ruled beside the crown, no longer hidden, but enthroned in white-robed sanctuaries that touched the sky. The Sasanian achievement in transforming the ancient tradition into a comprehensive system governing all aspects of life represented both culmination and conclusion. The elaborate structures they created would prove both too rigid to adapt to new challenges and too identified with Persian rule to survive its collapse. The coming catastrophe would shatter kingdoms, but the sacred fires and the truths they carried would outlast the empire that once gave them life. Rostam, a merchant on the edge of death, looked deep into the sacred fire at the temple in Ray. The priest beside him spoke of what awaited. 3 nights his soul would linger near his body, reliving every deed of his 70 winters. On the dawn of the 4th day would come the crossing. The Chinvat bridge, narrow as a blade's edge for the wicked, wide as a highway for the righteous. The merchant's fingers tightened on his prayer beads. He had given generously to the poor, but had he given enough? He had spoken truth in his dealings, but what of that contract in Merv, where he had remained silent about the flaw in his silk? The cosmology that gave shape to Rostam's final moments had been refined over centuries into a vision of existence both terrifying and magnificent. Before time itself began, the ancient texts proclaimed, Ahura Mazda dwelt alone in endless light, complete in his perfection, yet knowing through omniscience that in the abyss below lurked Angra-Mainyu, the destructive spirit who existed as pure negation, the absolute antithesis of all that was righteous and true. The wise Lord faced a choice that would define the nature of reality itself: remain in splendid isolation, forever untouchable, but also forever incomplete, or risk everything by bringing forth a universe where darkness could invade, but ultimately be defeated. This primordial decision was no mere whim of celestial creativity, but a calculated strategy born of perfect wisdom. Ahura Mazda understood that Angra-Mainyu's existence as pure destruction meant he could create nothing original, only corrupt what already existed. By manifesting the cosmos, the Lord of Wisdom was setting a trap, luring darkness into the realm of time where, unlike in eternity, all things must eventually end. The material world would become a battlefield, but one where the outcome was ultimately certain, for righteousness possessed substance while falsehood was merely shadow. For 3,000 years, the universe existed in pure spiritual form, a perfect thought in the mind of the Creator. During this age of preparation, the 7 Amesha Spentas emerged as the first emanations of holy will. Vohumana, the good mind, represented the cognitive faculty that chose righteousness. Asha Vahishta, best order, embodied the universal principle that governed both physical laws and moral principles. Kshatra Vairya, desirable dominion, expressed the legitimate authority that maintained justice. Spenta Armaiti, holy devotion, manifested as the earth itself and the humility required to tend it. Harvatat and Ameritat, wholeness and immortality, promised the perfection that awaited those who chose the path of light. These were not abstract concepts, but living beings, each governing both a portion of the material world and an aspect of the spiritual life. Vohumana protected cattle and all beneficial animals while inspiring good thoughts in human minds. Asha Vahishta maintained fire while establishing truth in human hearts. The believers who invoked these powers were not merely reciting names, but activating cosmic forces that responded to sincere devotion with tangible assistance. Below these great emanations ranked countless Yazatas, celestial beings worthy of worship, who served as intermediaries between the supreme deity and creation. Mithra rode his chariot across the sky, witnessing all contracts and punishing those who broke their word. Anahita governed the waters, blessing those who kept her streams pure, while withholding rain from lands where falsehood reigned. Sraosha, most active of all heavenly agents, battled demons each night and carried the prayers of the faithful to heaven's highest throne. When Angra-Mainyu finally perceived the light above him, his reaction shattered the boundary between potential and actual. ancient texts describe his assault in terms that blend metaphysical abstraction with visceral horror. A shriek that created discord, a charge that brought collision, an invasion that introduced death into a realm that had known only life. With him came the Devas, those false gods who had chosen rebellion, and the Druges, demons of specific corruptions, Eshma of wrath, Ajidahaka, the three-headed dragon, Jahi, the whore who awakened menstruation. The first casualty was Gaiamartin, the primordial man who embodied humanity's perfection before the fall. As he died, the first death in a universe that had never known ending, his body released precious metals into the earth, transforming even his destruction into a source of future benefit. From his seed, preserved by the Yazatas, would eventually spring Mashia and Mashiana, the human couple who would face the terrible gift of moral choice in a world where wrong decisions carried genuine consequences. These first humans emerged into a paradise already scarred by conflict. The plants that should have borne only nourishment now included thorns and poisons. Animals that were created gentle now knew fear and predation. The very elements that sustained life, water, earth, air, and fire, could also bring destruction when corrupted by demonic influence. Yet within this damaged realm remained clear signs of its original perfection, beauty, and harmony that called humanity to remember and restore what had been lost. Mashia and Mashiana initially chose righteousness, recognizing Ahura Mazda as creator and offering proper worship. But the demons excelled at exploiting human psychology, understanding that direct assault often failed where subtle suggestion succeeded. When the couple grew proud of their virtue, Angra Mainyu whispered that perhaps they, not some distant deity, were responsible for their own excellence. This first lie, that the creation had fashioned itself, opened the floodgates to every other form of self-deception and moral failure. From this original pair descended all humanity, each individual inheriting both the capacity for righteousness implanted by Ahura Mazda and the vulnerability to deception introduced by the demonic assault. Yet Zoroastrian theology rejected any notion of inherited guilt or original sin that would damn souls before they could choose. Every person entered the world with their fravashi, a pre-existent guardian spirit that had voluntarily accepted incarnation to participate in the universal struggle. Birth was thus not a punishment but an honor, a holy commission to serve as a warrior of Asher in the material battlefield. The weapons provided for this warfare seemed almost insultingly simple when compared to the eternal stakes involved. Humata, Hukta, Havashta. Good thoughts, good words, good deeds formed a triadic formula that any child could memorize, yet few adults perfectly practiced. Behind this simplicity lay profound wisdom. Since Angra Mainyu's power stemmed from deception, the counter-weapon must be integrity expressed through every medium available to embodied beings. Thought established the intention, word proclaimed the commitment, and deed manifested the reality. A woman in bulk demonstrated this principle when she discovered a merchant cheating her neighbors with false weights. Her righteous thought recognized the injustice. Her honest word publicly exposed the deception, despite threats of retaliation. Her just deed involved organizing a council to ensure fair trading practices throughout the market. Each action strengthened Asher in the universe, while weakening Druge's hold on human society. She had become, in that moment, a soldier as significant as any who wielded sword against foreign invaders. Conversely, every moral failure reinforced the enemy's position. The judge who accepted bribes didn't merely enrich himself unjustly, he literally strengthened Druge in the universal balance. The farmer who allowed weeds to choke his fields through laziness gave physical territory to the forces of chaos. The priest who performed rituals mechanically without understanding their meaning reduced sacred acts to empty theatre that mocked rather than honored the holy. This eternal accountancy meant that no action, however trivial it might seem, lacked ultimate significance. The Zoroastrian hell awaited those who had consistently chosen alignment with the lie, but its torments were not arbitrary punishments imposed by celestial sadism. Rather, they represented the natural consequences of spiritual choices made manifest. Those who had spread discord found themselves in a realm of absolute isolation. Those who had polluted the elements experienced an environment of ultimate filth. The geography of damnation mapped precisely onto the topology of sin. Medieval texts elaborated these punishments with a specificity that served both as warning and theological instruction. The man who had watered milk suffered demons pouring molten metal down his throat. The woman who had refused charity to the hungry found herself eternally starving while watching others feast. Yet even these graphic descriptions emphasized justice rather than cruelty. Each soul experienced exactly what it had inflicted on others, forcing recognition of the harm it had caused. Paradise offered corresponding rewards, but these too reflected earned consequences rather than arbitrary gifts. The House of Song welcomed those who had lived by truth, its ascending levels marking degrees of spiritual achievement. The person who had simply avoided major sins might dwell in the region of good thoughts, experiencing peace but not ecstasy. Those who had actively fought for justice ascended to good words, where they found companionship with others who had proclaimed truth despite danger. The highest level, good deeds, was reserved for those whose actions had significantly advanced the cause of light in the world. Between salvation and damnation stretched Heimstagen, that grey realm for those whose lives balanced precisely between good and wickedness. This was no gentle purgatory, but a place of profound discomfort, neither hot nor cold, neither light nor dark, neither companionship nor solitude. Its inhabitants experienced the spiritual equivalent of lukewarm water, an existence that reflected their own lukewarm commitment to the cosmic struggle. They had neither joined Ahura Mazda's army nor enlisted with Angra Mainyu, and their reward was precisely the nothingness they had chosen. The mechanism of judgment combined heavenly justice with psychological reality in ways that anticipated modern understandings of conscience and self-awareness. For 3 days and nights after death, the soul remained near its former body, experiencing a preview of its fate. The righteous smelled perfume and heard beautiful music, while the wicked endured stenches and horrible sounds. This period served not as torture, but as preparation, allowing the consciousness to understand what its choices had created. On the morning of the 4th day came the approach to Chinvat Bridge, that razor span across the abyss between earth and the spiritual realms. Here waited the 3 judges: Mithra, who never slept; Sraosha, who had protected the soul during life; and Rashnu, whose scales measured deeds with perfect accuracy. Yet their judgment merely confirmed what the soul had already determined through its accumulated choices. Free will, that dangerous gift that made humans superior, even to the Yazatas who could not choose wickedness, remained paramount even at this ultimate threshold. The soul's own Dana appeared at this crucial moment, manifesting as either a beautiful maiden or a hideous hag. This was not some external judge, but the person's own true nature made visible, the sum of all thoughts, words, and deeds given form. The righteous soul recognized in this figure the beauty it had created through moral choices, while the wicked confronted the ugliness it had cultivated through alignment with the lie. As each soul attempted to cross, the bridge responded to its spiritual weight. For those who had lived by Asher, it broadened into a comfortable highway. For those who had chosen falsehood, it narrowed until they plummeted into the abyss. The moderate sinners might cling to the edge, pulled down by their crimes, but not yet fully fallen, until the weight of their own choices determined their fate. This was judgment as physics rather than jurisprudence, spiritual gravity operating as inexorably as its material counterpart. Yet individual salvation or damnation formed only part of Zoroastrian eschatology. The texts spoke insistently of Frashokereti, the making wonderful, when the entire cosmos would be renovated and wickedness finally expelled from existence. This was no apocalyptic destruction, but universal healing, the completion of Ahura Mazda's primordial strategy to lure darkness into time where it could be definitively defeated. The process would begin with the arrival of 3 saviors, each born from the miraculously preserved seed of Zoroaster himself. Al-Shaddar would appear when righteousness had declined to desperate levels, restoring enough truth to postpone the final collapse. Al-Shaddar Ma would bring greater renovations, establishing justice throughout the earth. Finally, Saoshyant, whose name simply meant one who brings benefit, would inaugurate the final transformation. Under Saoshyant's leadership, humanity would unite in common purpose for the first time since Mashia and Mashiana's fall. The final battle would see every soul that had ever lived choose its ultimate allegiance. Ajidahaka, the great dragon bound beneath Mount Demavand, would break free for one last rampage before being slain by the resurrected hero Garshasp. The Yazatas would descend to fight alongside humanity, while the divers made their last desperate stand. The renovation itself would transform the very structure of reality. Mountains would melt, pouring forth rivers of molten metal that served as the final purification. For the righteous, this stream would feel warm and comforting as milk, washing away any remaining impurities. For the wicked, it would burn away the accumulated corruption of ages. Yet, and here, Zoroastrian optimism reached its peak, none would be destroyed. Even the most corrupt would emerge cleansed, ready to join in the universal recognition of Asher. This physical resurrection formed a crucial component of Zoroastrian hope. Bodies would be reconstituted from their scattered elements, but transformed into forms that needed neither food nor sleep. Families would reunite, but without the jealousies and conflicts that had marked earthly relationships. The earth itself would be renewed, its surface made smooth and fertile, neither too hot nor too cold. A garden where humanity could dwell in eternal fellowship. Some texts suggested that even Angramenyu might be redeemed rather than destroyed, that the destructive spirit himself would finally recognize the futility of opposing righteousness and join in worshipping Ahura Mazda. Others maintained he would simply cease to exist, darkness dispersing when no consciousness remained to sustain it. Either way, dualism would end with the absolute triumph of unity, the eternal struggle resolved forever in favor of light. Fire would play the central role in this universal transformation, as it had throughout the entire drama. The sacred element that had witnessed every sacrifice, heard every prayer, and sustained every act of worship would become the agent of supreme purification. The rivers of molten metal were liquid flame, the fundamental element of righteousness made manifest at universal scale. Every hearth fire tended through the ages, every temple flame maintained through persecution, had been preparation for this ultimate conflagration that would burn away the very possibility of falsehood. Some saw the vision as too grounded in the material, focused more on bodily resurrection than spiritual ascent. Others questioned its insistence on a linear timeline, with a final ending instead of recurring cycles. Even within the Mazdean tradition, there were those who felt symbolic meaning might hold more truth than a literal cosmic renewal. Yet for most believers, the concrete specificity of these promises provided exactly the hope they needed to persevere through lives often marked by hardship and injustice. The farmer whose fields were destroyed by nomadic raids could endure knowing that ultimate justice awaited. The woman whose children died from plague could find comfort in promised reunion. The merchant who chose honesty despite competitive disadvantage knew his choices mattered on an eternal scale. To light the fire was to join a universal war. One soul, one choice, echoing across all existence. Every dawn prayer strengthened the forces preparing for renovation. Every act of charity provided resources for the final battle. Every honest word added weight to the scales that would finally tip decisively toward light. The sacred flames burning in 10,000 temples were not mere symbols, but actual participants in the supreme drama. Their smoke carrying human aspirations to the Yazatas, who recorded every deed in preparation for the final accounting. The merchant Rostam, as his breathing slowed in the temple at Ray, understood that his imminent journey across the Chinvat Bridge was both utterly personal and completely universal. His choices, the charity given and withheld, the honesty spoken and suppressed, the prayers offered and neglected, had shaped not only his own fate, but contributed to the supreme balance between light and darkness. In a universe where every thought mattered and every deed echoed through eternity, he had been a soldier in the greatest war ever fought. Now, as the sacred fire flickered in his dimming vision, he would discover whether his service had been sufficient for the crossing that awaited with the dawn. As the sacred flame flickered in its silver urn, Khosrow II stood still in the palace at Ctesiphon, watching a messenger prostrate himself before him. The news from Syria was catastrophic. Heraclius had broken through, and the true cross, that Christian relic captured 14 years earlier, would soon be lost. The sovereign who styled himself beloved of Ahura Mazda and companion of the stars felt the weight of cosmic failure settling upon his shoulders. Outside, in the great fire temple of the capital, priests maintained their vigils, unaware that they tended flames which would soon be scattered to the winds of history. The early decades of the 7th century had witnessed the Sasanian Empire reach heights that rivaled the glory of the Achaemenids. From the Indus to the Mediterranean, from the Caucasus to Yemen, the banner of the Sasanids flew over territories that encompassed nearly a quarter of the world's population. In every major city, sacred fires burned in magnificent temples, where Mobds and Urbads maintained the elaborate rituals that had been codified over centuries. The integration of throne and altar seemed complete, a synthesis that promised to endure until the final renovation of the world. Beneath this glittering surface, fractures had been spreading like cracks in sun-baked earth. The endless wars with Byzantium, that other great empire which claimed divine sanction for its rule, had drained treasuries and devastated frontier provinces. Khosrow I, called the Just, had managed these conflicts with wisdom and restraint. But his grandson Khosrow II pursued victory with an obsession that would ultimately consume the realm he sought to glorify. The capture of Jerusalem in 614, the seizure of Egypt's grain supplies, the advance to the very walls of Constantinople, each triumph had seemed to vindicate the righteousness of the Zoroastrian cause, while actually hastening its doom. The priesthood, grown powerful through centuries of state patronage, had become as much a political institution as a spiritual one. The position of Mobadan Mobed, chief of chiefs among the clergy, carried influence that rivaled that of the greatest nobles. Temple estates encompassed vast territories, worked by thousands of peasants whose labor supported not just the sacred flames, but entire hierarchies of religious administrators, scholars, and servants. This concentration of wealth and power in clerical hands created resentments that enemies would soon exploit with devastating effectiveness. Within the sanctuaries themselves, the ancient simplicity of the prophet's message had been elaborated into systems of such complexity that common believers often felt excluded from their own faith. The Avesta, finally compiled in written form during the reign of Khosrow I, comprised 21 nasks, or books, each subdivided into numerous chapters, dealing with every conceivable aspect of ritual lore and theological speculation. Mastery of these texts required years of study in the seminary schools attached to major temples, creating a learned elite whose knowledge separated them from the farmers and merchants who formed the backbone of the believing community. The purity laws, always important in Zoroastrian practice, had evolved into elaborate codes that governed every aspect of daily life: contact with dead matter, the onset of menstruation. Even the cutting of hair and nails required specific purification rituals that could only be properly performed with priestly guidance. While these regulations served to maintain the cosmic struggle against pollution and decay, they also created barriers that made full religious participation increasingly difficult for those engaged in the messy realities of agriculture, trade, and warfare. In 628, when Heraclius finally forced a humiliating peace upon the Sasanians, the cosmic implications seemed clear to believers and skeptics alike. How could the forces of truth suffer defeat at the hands of those who denied the sacred fire? The theological crisis deepened when Khosrow II was murdered by his own son, violating the sacred bonds of family that Zoroastrian ethics held paramount. The rapid succession of rulers that followed, 4 emperors in 4 years, suggested that divine favor had indeed been withdrawn from the dynasty that had claimed to rule by heavenly mandate. Meanwhile, in the deserts of Arabia, a new force was stirring that would prove more devastating to the established order than any Byzantine army. The merchants and nobles of Ctesiphon knew of the Arabs, of course, tribal peoples who served as useful buffer states between the empire and the wasteland, sometimes fighting as auxiliaries in the endless frontier wars. That these scattered tribes could unite under a new faith and challenge the might of both Persian and Byzantine power seemed as unlikely as the desert itself bringing forth gardens. The first warnings came from the frontier fortress of Hira in 633, where Arab forces appeared with unexpected coordination and purpose. The garrison commander, accustomed to dealing with tribal raids that sought quick plunder, found himself facing an enemy that spoke of conquest in the name of a prophet and a god who demanded submission. When the defenders invoked the protection of Ahura Mazda and the sacred fires, the Arabs responded with verses from their own holy book that dismissed both Zoroastrian dualism and Christian trinity as corruptions of true monotheism. Yazdegerd III, last of the Sasanian monarchs, ascended to a throne that was already crumbling beneath him. A boy of 16, when crowned in 632, he inherited an empire exhausted by decades of war, riddled with religious doubts, and defended by armies whose loyalty had been shattered by civil conflict. The royal fires still burned in the palace, tended by priests who assured the young Shah that this crisis, like so many before, would pass. But the Arab armies pressing northward from Mesopotamia moved with a confidence born of absolute faith in their destiny. The Battle of Qadisiyah in 636 became the Sasanian Empire's Gaugamela, a catastrophe from which there would be no recovery. For 3 days, Persian forces held their ground against the Arab assault, the war elephants and heavily armored cavalry that had terrorized enemies for centuries, fighting with desperate courage. On the third night, a sandstorm arose from the desert, blinding the defenders while the Arabs, accustomed to such conditions, pressed their attack. When morning came, the cream of the Persian nobility lay dead on the field, and with them died the military tradition that stretched back to the Achaemenids. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, the Arab commander, entered Ctesiphon in 637 to find the capital largely abandoned. Yazdegerd had fled eastward, taking with him whatever portable treasures could be loaded onto pack animals. In the throne room, where Khosrow II had once received ambassadors from across the known world, Arab warriors performed their prayers facing Mecca. The great fire temple of the capital, one of the most sacred sites in the Zoroastrian world, stood empty, its eternal flame extinguished for the first time in 4 centuries. The systematic destruction of fire temples that followed the Arab conquest represented more than simple religious persecution. It was an assault on the entire cosmology that had shaped Persian civilization. At Ganzak, where pilgrims had once walked barefoot across frozen ground to reach the sacred flames, Muslim soldiers threw down the altars and scattered the ashes to the wind. The priests who resisted were given the choice that would echo through the centuries: conversion, death, or the acceptance of dhimmi status with its attendant humiliations and restrictions. Still, even as the physical infrastructure of their faith crumbled, many Zoroastrians found ways to preserve the essential elements of their tradition. A Mobad named Adobad led a group of priests in a desperate mission to save the most sacred flame from Istakhur before the city fell. Working through the night, they transferred the holy fire to specially prepared vessels, dividing it among several groups to increase the chances that at least one would reach safety. Their journey through the Zagros mountains, pursued by Arab cavalry and beset by bandits taking advantage of the chaos, became legendary among the faithful. The Battle of Nehavand in 642 marked the decisive end of organized Persian resistance. The assembled forces of the eastern provinces, led by commanders who remembered the empire's glory days, made their final stand on ground chosen for its defensive advantages. But tactical superiority meant nothing against an enemy convinced of divine support. As the Persian line broke and fled, observers reported seeing eagles circling overhead. Which side's victory they heralded depended on the faith of the interpreter. In the confusion of collapse, different communities made different choices for survival. The nobility, whose entire identity was bound up with the imperial system, often chose exile over submission. Caravans of refugees streamed eastward toward lands still beyond Arab reach, to Tabaristan on the Caspian coast, to Sistan in the eastern marches, to the mountain fastnesses of the Hindu Kush, where local rulers still maintained independence. They carried with them not just material treasures, but the rituals, texts, and memories that would allow the faith to reconstitute itself in safer havens. The peasantry, tied to the land and lacking resources for flight, faced starker choices. Some converted to the new faith, finding in Islam's emphasis on submission to one God, an echo of Zoroastrian monotheism, stripped of its complex theology. Others accepted dhimmi status, paying the special taxes and accepting the social restrictions that allowed them to maintain their ancestral religion at the cost of second-class citizenship. Still others found ways to blend public conformity with private devotion, maintaining household flames while outwardly accepting the new order. Conquerors paid special attention to the Zoroastrian priests, recognizing them as likely sources of organized defiance. The seminary schools were closed, their libraries scattered or destroyed, the oral traditions that had complemented written texts, the precise pronunciations of Avestan prayers, the melodies of sacred hymns, the interpretive commentaries passed from teacher to student, faced extinction as the chains of transmission were severed. Young men who would have entered religious service found other careers or fled to regions where they could still receive proper training. One of the most poignant stories from this period concerns the fate of the Great Library at Istakir. As Arab forces approached the city, the chief librarian, an elderly Herbad named Mihr Nasser, faced an impossible choice. The collection included not just religious texts, but astronomical tables, medical treatises, historical chronicles, and philosophical works representing centuries of Persian intellectual achievement. Knowing he could save only a fraction, he selected what he deemed essential: the complete Avesta, the most important theological commentaries, and the ritual manuals necessary for maintaining proper worship. The rest, irreplaceable works of science and literature, he ordered burned rather than see them desecrated by the invaders. Changes to once holy places showed the depth and reach of the religious transformation. At Naqshi Rustam, where Achaemenid kings had carved their tombs into living rock, and Sasanian monarchs had added their own monuments to royal glory, Muslim authorities established a garrison that used the ancient reliefs for target practice. The great fire altar that had stood before the tombs was demolished, its stones incorporated into a mosque that proclaimed the supremacy of the new dispensation. Pilgrims who had once come to honor their ancestral faith now found their sacred geography rewritten in an alien religious language. The decline of Zoroastrian influence was hastened by economic pressures. Temple estates were taken, either redistributed to Muslim newcomers or folded into the treasury. Without these material foundations, maintaining the priesthood became increasingly difficult. Families that had produced mobs for generations found themselves reduced to poverty, forced to choose between abandoning their hereditary calling or watching their children starve. The intricate networks of patronage and support that had sustained religious life for centuries dissolved within a single generation. The response of the faithful to these catastrophes varied according to temperament and circumstance. Some saw the Arab conquest as a test permitted by Ahura Mazda, comparable to the trials suffered under Alexander or during the Hellenistic period. They counseled patience and preservation, maintaining that the cosmic drama was far from over and that righteousness would ultimately triumph. Others interpreted events through an apocalyptic lens, seeing in the Muslim victories signs that the final renovation was approaching when all wrongs would be righted. In the eastern provinces, where Arab control remained tenuous for decades, forms of resistance emerged that blended religious revival with political rebellion. A charismatic priest named Vindafar proclaimed himself the representative of the hidden imam of the Zoroastrians, a messianic figure who would restore the good religion to its rightful place. His movement attracted thousands of followers before being crushed by Muslim forces, but similar uprisings would continue to erupt periodically, each claiming divine sanction for the struggle against Islamic rule. The compilation of the Denkard, one of the most important surviving Zoroastrian texts, began during this period as an attempt to preserve essential knowledge before it was lost forever. Written in Middle Persian rather than the sacred Avestan language, it represented a democratization of religious knowledge born of necessity. If the elaborate priestly hierarchies could no longer be maintained, then ordinary believers needed access to the theological and practical information necessary for maintaining their faith. The text's encyclopedic scope, covering everything from cosmology to dietary laws, reflected the urgent need to codify oral traditions before their transmitters perished. Throughout the upheaval, women quietly upheld Zoroastrian customs, playing essential yet largely overlooked roles. With many men dead in battle or fled into exile, mothers and grandmothers became the primary transmitters of prayers, rituals, and religious stories to the next generation. The sacred flames that had once burned in public temples found refuge in kitchen hearths, tended by women who understood that maintaining this connection to the divine light was essential for their community's spiritual survival. Their quiet resistance ensured continuity even when public expression of the faith became dangerous or impossible. By 651, when Yazdegerd III was murdered by a miller in Merv, an ignominious end for the heir of Cyrus and Ardashir, the Sasanian Empire had ceased to exist as a political entity, but the faith that had shaped and been shaped by Persian royalty for over 1,000 years proved more resilient than the dynasty it had served. In hidden valleys and remote villages, in the homes of stubborn believers and the hearts of secret practitioners, the sacred flames continued to burn. The priests who had fled with their portable altars established new communities in Gujarat and other tolerant regions, planting seeds that would grow into the Parsi community of later centuries. The last great public ceremony of Sasanian Zoroastrianism occurred at Takhti Soliman in 650, just months before the site fell to Arab forces. The Mobadan Mobed himself presided over the ritual, knowing it would likely be the final time such elaborate ceremonies could be performed. As the sacred flames leapt high into the night sky, reflected in the volcanic lake that had made the site holy since time immemorial, the assembled priests chanted the ancient hymns with particular fervor. When dawn came, they carefully divided the fire among specially prepared vessels, each group of carriers departing in a different direction to maximize the chances of preservation. Looking back across the catastrophic decades of the 7th century, the transformation appears total and irreversible. The empire that had claimed divine mandate lay in ruins. The temples that had housed sacred flames for centuries stood empty or converted to alien purposes. The priesthood that had maintained elaborate rituals was scattered and impoverished. Yet the essential elements of the prophet's message, the choice between truth and falsehood, the sanctity of the elements, the promise of ultimate renovation, survived in forms adapted to radically changed circumstances. The age of empire had ended, but the age of endurance was just beginning. Empires fall, cities burn, but the sacred flame flickers on, buried in mountains, guarded in silence. In the grand sweep of cosmic time that Zoroastrian theology embraced, the Arab conquest was but another trial in the eternal struggle between light and darkness. The faithful who lived through these terrible years could not know that their quiet acts of preservation would ensure their tradition's survival into the 3rd millennium. They knew only that the fire must not die, that each flame tended in secret defiance of the new order was a victory for truth against the lie. In this knowledge, they found the strength to endure what seemed like the end of the world, transforming catastrophe into the foundation for an entirely new chapter in their ancient faith's remarkable history. Without armies, without kings, the fire temples became something more, sanctuaries of memory, of waiting, of hope. Dawn had not yet broken over the Elburz mountains when Rostam began his descent into the valley. The bundle on his back contained embers wrapped in layers of ash and cloth, holy fire from the altar at Ray, rescued before the authorities could discover its existence. For 3 days, he had traveled by night, avoiding the main roads where guards might question a lone traveler. Now, as the first light touched the peaks above him, He could see smoke rising from the hidden settlement below. They were waiting for him, these stubborn believers who refused to let their tradition die. By the start of the 8th century, Zoroastrianism was in full retreat. Its major urban sanctuaries had been leveled or reshaped into Muslim houses of worship. The priestly schools that had trained generations of modes were closed, their teachers dead or scattered. Yet in the margins of the Islamic Empire, in mountain valleys, desert oases, and coastal villages, groups of the faithful adapted to their new reality with remarkable ingenuity. What could not be preserved in marble and gold would be maintained in memory and ritual, in the flickering light of household hearths and the whispered prayers of midnight vigils. Like so many others, the village that welcomed Rostam offered a familiar kind of refuge. Built in a valley, accessible only through narrow passes that could be watched and defended, it housed perhaps 300 souls who maintained the old ways under the leadership of a Herbert named Bahram. The priest was young for his position. The older generation had mostly perished in the conquests, but he had memorized vast portions of the Avesta during his interrupted training at Istakhr. Each morning and evening, he led the villagers in prayers that had to be conducted quietly, lest the sound carry to less sympathetic settlements nearby. The ash repository, or kark, took on new significance in these concealed settlements. In the grand temples of the Sasanian era, the consecrated ash had been stored in elaborate chambers, testimony to centuries of continuous burning. Now, each handful of ash became precious evidence of continuity with the past. Families passed down small containers of ash, from parent to child, physical links to the great blazes that had once burned publicly. When a group's flame was extinguished by persecution or accident, these preserved ashes could be used to consecrate a new fire, ensuring that the chain of sanctity remained unbroken. In the eastern provinces of Khorasan and Transoxiana, where Arab control remained contested, different strategies for survival emerged. The local Iranian nobility, the Dihkans, maintained significant autonomy in exchange for tribute and nominal conversion. Many of these landlords practiced a form of dual identity, presenting themselves as Muslims to the authorities while secretly maintaining Zoroastrian practices. Their manor houses contained concealed chambers where holy lights burned, tended by priests who officially served as agricultural advisors or household servants. One such Dihkan, Vindadfar of Balkh, left records that illuminate this precarious existence. By day, he attended Friday prayers at the mosque, contributed to Islamic charities, and sent his sons to study the Quran. By night, he descended to a basement sanctuary where the flame of his ancestors burned in a silver urn. His detailed journal, discovered centuries later, records the mental gymnastics required to maintain this double life. I tell myself that Allah and Ahura Mazda are but names for the same divine truth, that the Prophet Muhammad was sent to the Arabs as Zoroaster was sent to us. Yet in my heart, I know this reconciliation is born of necessity, not conviction. The compilation of Middle Persian texts accelerated during this period, driven by the urgent need to preserve knowledge before it vanished entirely. The Denkard, that encyclopedic collection of Zoroastrian learning, grew through the efforts of priests who understood they were racing against time. Working by candlelight in hidden scriptoriums, they translated Avestan texts into the vernacular, added explanatory commentaries, and recorded oral traditions that might otherwise die with their transmitters. The focus shifted from elaborate theological speculation to practical guidance, how to maintain ritual purity in hostile environments, how to perform essential ceremonies without attracting attention. how to teach children their faith when public instruction was forbidden. Just as damaging as religious oppression was the economic shift that reshaped Zoroastrian communities. The temple estates that had supported the priesthood were long gone, confiscated by the state or redistributed to Muslim settlers. Priests who had once devoted themselves entirely to ritual and study now needed earthly professions to survive. Some became physicians, finding that their knowledge of purification and herbal remedies translated well to medical practice. Others worked as scribes or teachers, their literacy making them valuable even to Muslim employers. The Herbad Bahram supported himself as a sheep farmer, timing his pastoral duties to allow for dawn and dusk prayers. During these long years of marginalization, women became vital keepers of tradition. With public worship effectively closed to them even before the conquest, they had always maintained domestic rituals that now became the primary form of devotion for many families. The eternal light that had once burned on temple altars found refuge in kitchen hearths, where women ensured it never died. Prayers that had echoed through vast ceremonial halls were now whispered over cooking fires and oil lamps. Mothers taught daughters the proper way to feed the blaze, the words to speak while tending it, the significance of keeping this divine radiance alive in a darkening world. To maintain group identity, marriage customs shifted, carefully aligning themselves with the demands of Islamic legal frameworks. Since Muslim men could marry Zoroastrian women, but not vice versa, settlements developed elaborate strategies to prevent the loss of their daughters to conversion. Discrete networks arranged marriages between scattered Zoroastrian families, sometimes requiring travel of hundreds of miles to find suitable partners. The ceremony itself might be performed quietly in a private home, with Islamic authorities told merely that a family celebration was taking place. These unions, blessed before concealed altars rather than public shrines, maintained bloodlines and beliefs that might otherwise have been absorbed into the dominant culture. The development of the hearth fire theology represented a profound democratization of Zoroastrian practice, where once the tradition had centered on the great temple, blazes tended by hereditary priests, now every believer's home became a potential sanctuary. Theological justification for this shift came from reinterpretation of ancient texts that spoke of Atar's universal presence. If the divine radiance existed in every spark, then the humblest oil lamp possessed the same essential sanctity as the greatest altar. This theological adaptation, born of necessity, would prove crucial for the tradition's long-term survival. Merchant networks played an increasingly important role in maintaining connections between scattered settlements. Zoroastrian traders, traveling between Persia, Central Asia, and India, carried more than goods in their caravans. Concealed among bales of silk and sacks of spices were devotional texts, ritual implements, and messages between isolated groups. These merchants became informal clergy, performing marriages and funerals in places too small or too dangerous to support a permanent priest. Their travel documents, when they survive, reveal elaborate codes used to disguise spiritual content as commercial correspondence. The relationship with Islamic authorities varied dramatically by region and period. Under the early Abbasid caliphs, a degree of tolerance emerged that allowed some public expression of Zoroastrian identity. The translation movement centered in Baghdad drew on Zoroastrian scholars who possessed knowledge of Pahlavi texts containing Greek and Indian learning. Astronomers, physicians, and philosophers of Zoroastrian background contributed to the flowering of Islamic civilization while maintaining their private faith. Yet this tolerance remained fragile, subject to the whims of individual rulers and the pressures of religious politics. persecution could erupt suddenly and devastatingly. In 786, the governor of Sistan ordered the destruction of all remaining sanctuaries in his province, citing complaints from Muslim clerics about the corrupting influence of public flame worship. The Mobad Mihr Ormazd, who had maintained a small shrine in the provincial capital, was given the standard choice: conversion or death. He chose a third option, immolating himself in his own holy fire, rather than betray his beliefs or see the eternal light extinguished. His sacrifice inspired both increased devotion among the faithful and harsher crackdowns by authorities alarmed at such fanaticism. The Parsi migration to India, beginning in the 8th century and accelerating in the 9th, represented one survival strategy among many. These emigrants, whose name simply means Persian, carried consecrated embers across dangerous seas to establish new settlements in Gujarat and other western Indian regions. The story of their journey, preserved in the Chisa-i Sanjan, tells of blazes maintained on storm-tossed ships, of negotiations with Hindu rulers for land to build sanctuaries, of adaptations made to harmonize with Indian customs while preserving essential beliefs. Not all approved of this abandonment of the homeland. Many priests argued that the ancestral land of Iran itself was holy, and that leaving constituted a form of apostasy. Back in Iran, those who remained developed increasingly sophisticated forms of spiritual dissimulation. The practice of taqiyya, typically associated with Shia Islam, found parallels in Zoroastrian groups that learned to hide their true beliefs behind acceptable facades. A family might maintain a prayer room that could quickly be transformed into an innocent storage area if authorities arrived. Children learned from an early age to give different answers about their convictions depending on who was asking. This constant vigilance and deception took a psychological toll, creating settlements marked by suspicion and secrecy, even among themselves. The role of dreams and visions increased during this period of persecution. With normal channels of clerical authority disrupted, the faithful sought divine guidance through nocturnal revelations. The texts record numerous instances of Srausha or other yazatas appearing to worshippers with instructions for preserving holy flames, or warnings of impending persecution. Whether understood as genuine divine intervention or as psychological responses to stress, these visions provided comfort and direction to groups bereft of traditional leadership. A widow named Golnar in Yazd reported that Anahita herself had shown her where to dig a well that would provide pure water for ritual ablutions when the public sources were forbidden to Zoroastrians. Devotional writings were no longer the domain of professional scribes. They began to emerge from within family households. A father might spend years creating a single copy of the Vendidad to pass to his son, working by night after long days in the fields. The quality of these manuscripts varied wildly, some barely legible, others illuminated with touching if amateurish decorations. Errors crept in as copyists struggled with archaic languages they imperfectly understood. Yet each manuscript represented an act of devotion, a determination that the holy words would not vanish from the earth. These family texts, concealed in wall cavities or buried in jars, would surface centuries later as testimony to this era's quiet heroism. As Zoroastrian festivals evolved, they carried traces of what was lost and what was reshaped. Nowruz, the spring equinox celebration, proved resilient because it had been adopted into Persian culture broadly enough that even Islamic authorities could not suppress it entirely. Families gathered for meals that appeared purely social but included subtle spiritual elements. The Haft-Sin table with its 7 symbolic items, the jumping over blazes that echoed ancient purification rituals, Other festivals, more explicitly devotional, went underground. The Gahambar feasts, marking the 6 creations, were celebrated in private homes with trusted friends, the participants knowing that discovery could mean imprisonment or worse. In the realm of personal practice, the kushti, the consecrated cord worn by all initiated Zoroastrians, became a concealed badge of identity. Worn under clothing where it could not be seen, the cord reminded worshippers of their commitment to good thoughts, words, and deeds, even when public expression was impossible. The ritual of untying and retying the kushti during prayers took on new poignancy when performed in private. Some practitioners, forced by circumstances to appear in public without their kushti, would tie a simple thread around their waist as a substitute, maintaining the physical reminder of their spiritual obligations. The development of protective amulets and talismans reflected the people's sense of vulnerability. Small metal plates inscribed with Avestan prayers, miniature containers holding consecrated ash, carved stones with protective symbols. These objects proliferated among worshippers who felt surrounded by both physical and spiritual dangers. While Orthodox theology had always been suspicious of such material aids to devotion, the circumstances of persecution made their comfort irresistible. A child sent to work in a Muslim household might carry a tiny cylinder of ash sewn into their clothing, a tangible connection to their family's tradition. By the early 9th century, a degree of stability had emerged in the patterns of Zoroastrian survival. Groups had learned which Islamic authorities could be bribed, which regions offered relative safety, which professions allowed for discreet practice of their tradition. The urgent scramble for preservation of the 7th and 8th centuries gave way to more systematic efforts at long-term continuity. Private schools trained young men in abbreviated versions of the priestly curriculum. Networks of communication, often following trade routes, kept scattered populations informed of each other's existence and needs. When the Samanid dynasty rose in Transoxiana and Khorasan in 819, it opened the door to renewed Persian cultural expression, quietly including traces of Zoroastrian influence. While officially Muslim, the Samanids promoted Persian language and culture in ways that benefited all Iranians. Zoroastrian scribes and scholars found employment at the court, where their knowledge of pre-Islamic history and literature was valued. This cultural revival, while not extending to religious freedom, at least provided space for the preservation of texts and traditions that might otherwise have vanished. The story of the shrine at Baku illustrates the complex accommodations of this era. Built around natural gas vents that created eternal flames, the site had been revered since ancient times. Under Islamic rule, it officially ceased to be a Zoroastrian sanctuary, yet pilgrims continued to arrive, ostensibly to witness a natural wonder, but actually to perform discrete acts of worship. The Muslim authorities, recognizing the site's economic value as a tourist attraction, turned a blind eye to these devotions as long as they remained subtle. This pragmatic tolerance, replicated at various sites throughout the Persian world, allowed for continued, if constrained, spiritual practice. Preserving core elements of Zoroastrian cosmology, the Bundahishan, compiled in the 9th century, stood as a major intellectual milestone. Written in Middle Persian and drawing on ancient sources, this text provided the faithful with a comprehensive account of creation, the nature of the cosmos, and the eventual renovation of the world. Its emphasis on the ultimate triumph of good over evil offered hope to groups that must have sometimes wondered if they were living through the final darkness before the dawn. The text's survival in manuscripts concealed, transported, and copied through centuries of persecution, testifies to its importance for maintaining morale. As the 9th century drew to a close, the Zoroastrian population had achieved a precarious but sustainable equilibrium, reduced from millions to hundreds of thousands. Excluded from power and often from basic civil rights, they had nonetheless preserved the essential elements of their tradition. The eternal lights still burned, if now in humble hearths, rather than grand shrines. The prayers were still recited, if in whispers rather than public chants. The hope of cosmic renovation still sustained the faithful through their earthly trials. Over time, Zoroastrianism shifted from the grandeur of empire to the intimacy of private belief, its public role reduced to whispered devotion. The losses were incalculable. Texts destroyed, customs forgotten, populations scattered or absorbed. Yet what survived possessed a refined purity, like gold tested in flame. The worshippers who gathered in private to tend their holy lights were not there for social advantage or political gain. They risked everything simply to maintain their connection to the divine radiance that Zoroaster had revealed 2 millennia before. Anism from an imperial religion to a minority faith, from a public institution to a private devotion. The losses were incalculable. Texts destroyed, traditions forgotten, communities scattered or absorbed. Yet what survived possessed a refined purity, like gold tested in fire. The believers who gathered in secret to tend their sacred flames were not there for social advantage or political gain. They risked everything simply to maintain their connection to the divine light that Zoroaster had revealed 2 millennia before. Looking back from the vantage point of 900 AD, the transformation appears complete. The age of Zoroastrian empires had ended forever. The great sanctuaries were ruins or memories. The elaborate hierarchies and ceremonies of the Sasanian period existed only in texts that few could still read. Yet the essential message, choose righteousness over falsehood, maintain purity in thought, word, and deed, trust in the ultimate triumph of light, burned on in the hearts of the devoted. They had learned that external power was transient, but that interior conviction, carefully tended like a holy flame, could survive any persecution. The shrines no longer stood in marble cities, but the flame lived, carried not by kings, but by the faithful. In this great winnowing, Zoroastrianism discovered its capacity for survival through adaptation, its ability to maintain essential truths while transforming external forms. The concealed blazes of these centuries would eventually emerge into the light again, in India as the Parsi tradition, in Iran as small but persistent minorities, and in the global diaspora of modern times. But that emergence was built on the foundation laid by generations who refused to let the eternal light die, who passed the torch from parent to child through centuries of darkness, who proved that conviction could endure even when everything else was lost.